Welcome back to the Shared Services Advantage series. In our last episode, we talked about how to map your current state, expose the variation, and define your future state before centralizing. But once that work is done, the next question is who's going to run this thing? Because shared services doesn't run itself. Whether you're building the team in house or partnering with a BPO like Origo, the structure you put in place up front will make or break everything that follows. So, in today's episode, we're going to be walking through two tracks. If track number one, if you're building shared services yourself, and track number two, if you're partnering with a BPO to deliver it. And we'll talk through, what roles to prioritize early, how to build around process, and how to avoid the early stage traps that stall shared services before it even gets traction. And joining me on this episode, as always, is my amazing co-host, Gyner Ozgul, CEO at Fortis Fire. Gyner, I know you've been running on fumes this week. I hope you're ready and to dig in and share some insights.
Yes, I absolutely. I'm always ready, and thank you for having me. My head looks a little shiny today. I promise nothing's wrong. It's just the lighting in this room.
Well, look, I appreciate you showing up always, regardless of what's going on behind the scenes. So, why don't we kick off with step one? Because before we talk about scale or structure, it starts with assigning ownership. So, really, step one is you want to start with ownership,
Yep.
not just headcount. Whether you're going in-house or working with a BPO, you need someone accountable for making shared services actually work. And if you're building it in-house, you want to start clean and prioritize. You probably need a shared services director or a VP level. You might want to have one or two team leads for your pilot function that you want to kind of build a shared services structure around. And you probably would need an ops analyst for throughput SLAs and reporting. And it doesn't hurt if you have a trainer or a quality analyst lead if you're ramping up volume fast. Now, if you're working with a BPO, you still need an internal, let's call them service owner or shared services owner. Even if you're not doing the delivery yourself, you want that person to be that, your voice to the vendor, where they own the roadmap, the KPIs, the relationship. Think of them like a vendor manager of sorts. So, Gyner, when you've stood shared services up, either internally or through a partner, who absolutely needed to be in the seat early for you?
Well, first, you got to have the right sponsor, right? So, in
Mm,
my case, I have been the sponsor and I've assigned sponsorship.
that's
So,
a good point.
um, you want somebody who's as passionate about seeing it to be successful as you are, right? Because
Mm,
if they're not, then the outcomes are really hard to drive because you're managing like this change management undertone in addition. So you want to wipe that away, and you want to have a sponsor who has a lot of conviction in making it successful to begin with, right? So, and
and
that
who's
should
typically
be
the sponsor, Gyner? Like, is it like a C-suite,
yeah, it should be an
VP?
executive. It should be an executive in the
Okay,
organization that's a one level above whatever department you're trying this out at, right?
makes sense.
And the reason is you hopefully, but hope isn't a strategy, but
Mm,
you should have had the discussions with that sponsor and gotten them through some of the management challenges that we've talked about on the show before,
mm,
like, oh, offshore and people don't know things and language barriers and all the stuff that,
mm.
they talk about. Like, get through that conversation, set it aside, because then they're bought in. And now it's like, let's focus on the pilot and what do we need to be true for the pilot to be successful, right?
Love it.
So now once you've got that box checked, so now you have an executive that's kind of the sponsor, and ultimately they're accountable too, right? And
Mm.
you you want to make sure they understand. Then it's the department level manager that has to be assigned and be truly accountable to, like, how are you going to map out the process with the outsource provider? How are you going to think
Or
about,
internally, the
yeah,
transition, yeah.
and somebody who knows enough detail within the process to be useful. So making
Mm.
sure that you're not like picking somebody in the organization who really doesn't know transactionally how it works. They have to be
Mm.
somebody that knows enough of the detail or can get to the detail to help make it successful.
And is that a a new role or an extension of their existing role, Gyner?
I think when it starts, it's an extension, right? Because you're
An
still
extension.
talking about like essentially taking a little piece of it out and trying it. Um, if it's successful, then there needs to be consideration about how do you give them a permanent piece of that, right? So how are they managing that on the long
Mm,
term, evolving with it, reviewing the cycle, reviewing those process flows as they
mm.
change over time? Because as you remember from our old days together, a third party portal changes something. If that person isn't working with you to make you
They're
aware of the
disconnected
change,
from the ops,
then
yeah,
you're still operating under the
on
premise
the
of the
old.
old,
Mm,
mapped out process.
makes sense. Yeah, I love that, and this is a great segue to our next step, because once you've got that ownership locked in, really the next step is giving that owner a structure that's designed to really drive outcome, like you said, Gyner, not just manage people. So really, step 2 here is you want to build structure around process flow, not legacy org charts. So because shared services isn't a copy of your old org chart, right? It needs to be designed around how work actually happens, around workflows, not who used to report to who. So if you're building an in-house, um, the recommendation is you design pods around process flows like quote to cash, which typically includes billing and collection, AR, or procure to pay, right, which includes purchasing AP and so forth, and vendor management. Request resolution, right? And this is your dispatch, tier one, customer service, work order entry, scheduling, and whatnot. And each of these pods owns a defined workflow, right? There's a start and a finish. There are SLAs and output metrics, and a loop for process improvement. And like Gyner, you mentioned, it needs to connect between the internal team and the shared services, offshore or onshore, however you look at it. But corporate and shared services need to be able to be talking. So you want to make sure that team leads are accountable for end-to-end outcomes, not just tasks. Within a department, and they're
Right.
looking at activities. So now, if you're working with a BPO, on the other hand, on the second on the BPO track, you really need to push your vendor to mirror the structure. So they might have named leads by process, right? You have a team manager, or you have a service delivery manager across quote to cash workstream, but then you have leads under them that's handling billing or collection. You have a pod level SLA tracking, and you have clear ownership of outcomes, not just staffing, right? So Gyner, what has helped you break away from like the old function based silos and like build a team that runs like a real operating model here?
Yeah, I think it's setting the expectation of I expect success first and be firm about like that. And what does success mean? Here are the metrics and the baseline we're at today, and here's what we want to aspire to getting to, and here's how we get there. Right?
Mm,
You have to be very clear about your KPIs. So don't like dance around them. Like if you say your DSO is 70 days and you want to get it down to 60 days, then draw a line in the
mm,
sand and start working towards it, right?
mm,
Holding people accountable toward it and saying, hey, if the process, because remember, this is virtuous. You're going to define a process, and it doesn't mean it's right. It just means you defined it with that pod, right?
makes
This is
sense.
the process as it is today. And now you start working with a BPO provider, and all of a sudden the BPO, who by the way is good because they're not biased initially,
Mm,
right, is going to give you feedback on your process. Take
mm,
the feedback and improve the process, right?
mm.
And your KPIs will tell you that. And then start monitoring and make that fulsome and revisit the process and continue to improve it within the pod, right? And
Yep,
by the way, the other thing, don't forget to celebrate when you're
you're right.
doing well,
Right.
both with your onshore and potentially your BPO team. Celebrate the wins
I love
because
that.
people forget that, right? Your DSO goes from 70 to 68. Like, hey, 2 days is a big deal. We should celebrate
Right.
that. We did a really nice job, because then they'll continue to use that, and then it becomes its own culture, right? You're not having to push it from an executive standpoint. they're owning it, and they see the ability to go make change themselves.
I love that. And to your point, structure is only one part. There are requirements for success, and which gets us to step three, which is enablement. Because a shared services team, really, without infrastructure, is just a staffing list. So in step three here, you really want to build the enablement engine. And when I say enablement, we're talking about training, quality assurance, workforce management, HR, and even some sort of a PMO, because this is where most shared services teams stall. They hire the people, but they forget the support. So if you're building it in-house, you're on track A, the in-house track. What you need to have in place from ideally from day one is training, who will handle formal onboarding, skills calibration, SOPs, curriculums, LMS, right? Doing classes, because there's going to be a lot of training. You're going to be centralizing, you're going to be standardizing, and you need to retrain a lot of people on the process, or maybe new hires. You need to have quality assurance, right? You need to have scorecards, audits, coaching protocols. The third thing you need to have is reporting, having real-time visibility into SLA compliance, backlogs, productivity, cost. Most important, especially if there are cost synergies you're looking to capture. You need to have a workforce management. You need to think about capacity planning. Based on the volumes that we have across the portfolio. Now we're thinking at the platform level. We're not thinking at an individual opco level, right? So what does the capacity planning look like for the platform based on the demand, seasonality, right? How do we schedule? How do we forecast? These are very important things. The other thing that not a lot of people think about this upfront, at least when they're building their own in-house shared service or captive site, is HR and talent. There's a lot of work in redefining job descriptions, reassignment,
right.
Offer letters, contracts, internal mobility. I mean, there's a lot of work there. And one of the key also enablers here is maybe not a full-fledged PMO, but someone to manage transitions, intake, and improvements across functions, because the work doesn't end when you lift and shift the work, it starts. So you may need to expand your talent acquisition, your HR, and maybe put together some sort of a project management team to support the change effort, especially if you're rehiring, restructuring, or moving people across the functions. Now, with a BPO, if you're going the BPO track, maybe things is a little bit less involved, right? Or I should say a lot less involved. Because here, really, what you're focused on is you're defining early what level of process ownership you expect. And there are three levels. Are you asking your BPO partner to just give you staff and you manage the work, but they provide the people? Or you want it more co-managed? Hey, give me the people, but I also want you to do the training, the quality assurance, the workforce management, but I still want to own the process. I still want to be involved. I still want to, make sure that I know the names and the people who are, whether onshore or offshore, who's handling what transaction, and how are they doing, and you're doing kind of like a weekly review and you have direct access to them. Or you want them to just fully own it, right? You have clear SLAs, clear metrics, and they need to deliver to SLAs, and they deliver the process end to end and are accountable for the outcome. So whether whatever you choose, make sure that you write it clearly in the SOW. And if you're outsourcing, remember, most BPOs will manage their own recruiting, their own onboarding, their own HR admin. So that can really free up your internal HR and projects teams capacity significantly. So Gyner, how do you approach this internally so that enablement doesn't become an afterthought? And and with a BPO, like, how do you make sure everyone's is clear on who owns what, and how do you define that process ownership piece?
Well, I said KPIs earlier, but I think part of the process ownership is, there's the executive owner, and then there's the leader I talked about, but then there's make sure you understand as you step into it, what are the adjacent functions that it's going to touch. So if it's operations or finance or HR, kind of using your examples, you want to make sure that you establish that, hey, we're going to go through this, and the team has an accountability to make it successful if something comes their way, if it touches them. So if it's a job description rework, or if HR is part of the process and they want to be part of the interview process of using an offshore group, then that's fine. Then they have to be part of the process, and they should be reviewing job descriptions. They should be helping with them, and they should be part of the process, right, and accountable for it. What they can't do is say, I want to be part of the process, but I'm too busy to be part of the process, because you'll hear that, right? I like to call that a little bit of pocket vetoing that's going on, or silent vetoing. Like, no, if you're in, you're in. And if this is what you want, then I'm fine with it. But then you got to be in the process, just like you would be for any onshore talent. So I think it's important that everybody understands the roles and responsibilities, and you clearly outlay that before you get into it.
Absolutely. And I love, the nuances you're highlighting. And really, this a lot of times, comes from experience. But this is the advantage that you're getting, listening into this podcast is really, getting the benefit of, decades of experience. So, and you know what? And once that shared services starts running, really, and you start seeing signals of success, suddenly everyone wants a piece of it. And that's what brings us to step 4. You want to protect your focus and don't become the catch-all as a shared service center, because this is where all the work we talked about in the previous episode should pay off. You've mapped the current state and you've defined the future state. Now it's the time to draw a line, right? What stays with the business? What transitions to shared services? And if you're on the in-house track, you need to define clear process ownership by process step, not just by function. So you can avoid the mess of shared steps or half-owned activities. So example, if you do step 1 and an optical, shared services does step 2 and 3, and then you take back step 4. And that's where chaos lives, right? So instead, you want to set clear guardrails. We own step 1 to 3. You own from 4 to 7, right? And you want to literally write it into a RACI. Who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, right? You want to have a RACI, and you want to treat shared services like a business, even if it's internal, and you need to push back, and you want to have change, order management of sorts, right? If they want you to do a new task or whatever, you don't want to have you want to make sure that that's all formal and documented. And later on, this becomes critical if you decide to implement some sort of an internal billing or chargeback models, and which is a whole another topic for another episode. But it starts now with clarity. Now with a BPO, the same rules apply. Just because it's external doesn't mean you can let the lines blur. So in fact, you need even tighter clarity in your SOW or contract. So you want to define which steps the BPO fully owns, what the business retains, who's responsible for escalations, hands-offs, and decisions on any process changes. And you want to make it operational, like we said. You want to use RACI charts. You want to include it in the onboarding material, and make sure you revisit it during your quarterly reviews. So, how do you create that clarity, I guess, especially in the messy middle when teams want to hold on to control, but also expect that the shared services to just handle it?
It's a little bit of you have to be careful, right? Because remember, there's a cultural shift that's happening behind the scenes here, and your objective is to move a metric from A to B in a business, right? And you got people in the business that are like, well, when I run it, if anyone throws something at me, I just do it, right?
Exactly. And
there's
and it's very informal and organic process.
And now you're saying, hey, we're taking that organic process away with your service piece, and we're going to be very specific. So, to the two, like the executive sponsor and to the, functional leader, there has to be very clear direction that says nothing, like we have a defined problem statement, we have a defined scope. That's it. And if it changes or something materially changes, because you may find something out that comes back and says we need to revisit that, that's okay. Then let's have a discussion about it before we make a change. So don't, because what you're trying to do is make this successful, and the problem statement and the scope say this is what success is defined as. So if we find something later, so now we've taken that shared service function and offshored it or outsourced it, and now we say, oh, we didn't know that this subset of customers uses a different portal than we had thought. Well,
Mm.
maybe that changes your original problem statement now. Maybe you need more resources. Maybe your onshore resource assignment has to change, right?
Mm.
Maybe it's a totally different department that handles that. Then you should
Absolutely.
revisit that statement and have that be part of your process to say, hey, if the scope becomes bigger than what we define or the original problem statement, let's just agree to have a conversation about it. We can go fast, but we shouldn't change the scope impromptu, because then it may affect our outcomes, and it may look like your shared service outsourcing isn't working when really it's not your original outcome you were looking for.
Absolutely, and this is especially a little bit a radical change for opcos, right? Because you've got people at the opco, double hatting or triple hatting, right? In most companies, and they're doing billing, and then they're doing customer service, and then they're jumping on AP, and now you're telling me, you need, there's definition, but that's also how you scale. It's not just about shared services; it's just how you scale a process without, you know, clear definition and handoffs and KPIs. It's very difficult to scale a process. So it's just a good, honestly, business practice. And the shared service just so happens to be a forcing function to make that clear if it's not already. And once you have that clarity in place, now the team can move with confidence, and that's what sets you up for scale. So that brings us home with step 5. Start small, stabilize, and scale. And don't try to boil the ocean. Prove it with one clean function. And I remember early on, Gyner, one of your kind of approaches that you've always recommended is like, try it in one function. Start with a function like billing or customer service or AP. Stand it up, monitor it daily, hit your SLAs, and then share the wins internally to be able to scale it. And that applies whether it's in-house or with a BPO. But you want to push for stabilization phase, right? Especially with a BPO, you don't want to expand the scope until metrics, quality, and cycle times are locked in. So, Gyner, from your experience running, standing up shared services, like what does a good pilot looks like to you, and how do you know it's time to scale, or it's time to maybe keep it running for longer? Maybe it's time to pull back, and it wasn't a good experiment, and we need to rethink the approach. Like how do you what are the tell signs? What are you looking for?
Yeah. Well, early on, you should have defined your success metrics and your KPIs.
Mm.
The question is how close, and it's going to be a little different by business, right? So, how close are you to that outcome? And how close you are to that outcome is going to tell you do I scale this further, or do I need more time? What I'd be careful of is don't look for perfection in your outcome. I want to call that out, because sometimes it's like, well, if it's not at 100%, then I'm never going to scale it. Well, I would argue you're not at 100% now, and you continue to scale your deficiencies. So
Right.
any improvement should guide you to, should we scale this, right? Any improvement. And if it's 50%, 60%, 70%, there's a number there, probably north of 50%, right, on your target. So if, let's take the DSO example again. If you're at 70 days and your target is 60 days and you're at 65. So when I say 50%, it's that 50% of your targeted improvement. Something north of that should say it's probably okay to scale, right?
Right.
But it really depends on your business and what function you're putting it in. But I personally use 50% as like, okay, we can have a constructive conversation. Anything below 50%, it's like, hey, let's extend it out maybe another 30 days and see how we do.
So and Gyner, and how do you look at, like, okay, let's stabilize? Do you also consider like there's a stabilization phase first? Like it's like, okay, here's the current benchmark. Here's how we're performing today. Like in the first 30, 60, 90 day, I just want you to perform as good, at least as good, ideally better than how we're doing today. And then there's like the improvement phase. right? There's like, okay, let's stabilize. We're shifting process. We're bringing on new. How do you think about like stabilize first, then improve, or do you expect the improvement to happen alongside the stabilization, and what time frames are we talking about here?
Um, I think the time frames are somewhere in the again, depending on the function and depending on your problem statement, you should see material movement to that 50% mark within about 90 days if you're doing this right. Ideally, you want it shorter, right? Because shorter is always better because it makes it a compelling case for go do it and make it bigger and make it faster. But if you get it within 90 days, I think that's good movement. You're showing really good movement within your process.
So you expect to stabilize, take the first 30 days, 45 days post go live, after you hired the team, trained them, they went live. You expect them to quickly, get to stable state, reach current benchmark, and then bring the improvement. Makes sense.
That's right.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, there you have it. Whether you're building shared services in-house or with a BPO, this is your 5-step playbook. Assign ownership early, build structure around process flow, not functions. Make sure that you're standing up enablement and support from day one. And define what's in and what's out with crystal clear accountability. And last but not least, deliver one win before you scale. And this is how you build shared services that earns the right to grow, not just exist. And in our next episode, we'll shift focus to managing demand. Once that shared service center is live, how do you manage intake? What's that process look like? And we're going to get really tactical there. And how do you say yes to the right work and no to the wrong work, without stalling the entire model? So we'll cover that in episode 7. Gyner, thank you again for your insights as always, and we will see you on the next one.
Thanks, Yassin.
Thank you.